Okay, so I'm going to talk about spring fishing again, but very specifically, I want to talk about fishing jig head, like soft plastic bucktail plugs, very close to the bottom to catch those first bass of spring. And this technique does work very well for big fish as well. So, what I like to do when I'm fishing for the first fish of the spring, I tend to try to find places where the water's warmest. Some of my favorite places to fish are rivers and estuaries, and the reason for this being when the sun bakes on the mud of the estuary or river, it will warm that mud up, and then when the water comes in on the incoming tides, the water will get warm, and what happens is when that's dumping out and the striped bass are cruising down the coast, migrating back north, what will happen is those fish will stop off into estuaries like they would a gas station on the highway, feed, and then continue on their migration further down the coast. So what you can do to, as well as like catch really big fish, you can also catch lots of schoolies. And for here on Cape Ann, where I fish primarily, the first fish that show up on Cape Ann are pretty small bass. So what I like to do is fish a lot lighter tackle. I'm fishing stuff that's like 6 to 9 foot rods, 10 to 30 pound line. So like, very light setups. Looking for the first like schoolies in the spring, I definitely am going to be fishing a 6-7 foot rod. And what I really like to do is I like to fish during the outgoing tides right around creek mouths when the water's kind of flooding out of these little creeks. The bass will stage up in those little areas and feed on little bait fish from, little mud minnows to sand eels. Sometimes you have little bay anchovies, silver sides, different things like that that are dumping out of the estuary, and even crabs in certain scenarios. They'll be eating little like crustaceans and shrimp and stuff. So what I like to do is I like to position myself where I'm casting just past one of these creek mouths, and I'm slowly bringing my lure in front of the creek mouth. Generally, you're going to hit a seam in the current, which you can actually visually see sometimes. What you'll see is almost a slick piece of water, and then it'll get maybe a little bit more ripply along either side of it. That little transition period is going to be where the current is meeting slack water. A lot of the time the bass will sit on these transition seams here, and that's when you'll get most of your hookups, as well as you'll realize, okay, my lure is starting to drift faster, so I can slow down my retrieve, let it sink down a little further. As far as the retrieve goes for something like a bucktail or an algag whippet fish, it doesn't vary a whole lot, but what I'm trying to do is present the lure in front of the face of the fish as long as possible. This time of year, the bass tend to be pretty finicky, so if I can present my lure in front of them and make that opportunistic hunting mind of the striped bass kick in and say, okay, this thing's right in front of my nose, I gotta eat it, even if they're not feeding super aggressively, this will oftentimes be your best chance at getting into some nice fish. So what I'll do is I'll cast just up current, I'll sweep it into the seam of where the current seam is, where the water's dumping out of that little creek mouth, and I'll stop my retrieve. I'll let it basically fall and drop and swing in the current right in front of the face of the mouth. As soon as it goes right in front of their face, you tend to get that boom, you're going to get that hit. And this can really vary from the lightest little like grab to a very electric whack. And depending on the attitude of the fish, the day, if it's sunny or cloudy or rainy, low pressure systems, everything like that's going to play a role into whether the bass are going to be feeding more and more aggressively. Honestly, during the spring, you're going to tend to find that the bite will be best when the air temperature and the sun and everything is warm. So I've always found that sunny spring days, especially late in the day, somewhere around sunset, tend to be the best times to get into early spring bass. And for here on Cape Ann, a lot of the time, they're really little bass, but for us, any action that you're seeing like that is going to be a blessing, because those are those first fish of the season. You're always super excited for them, and it's great to get the rod bent after a super long winter.